August 10, 1792. Parisian radicals and armed citizens stormed the Tuileries Palace. The Swiss guards defending the king fight back, killing hundreds of attackers before being overwhelmed and massacred themselves. The king and his family flee to the Assembly for protection. The Assembly, facing an armed mob, has no choice but to suspend the monarchy and call for elections to a new national convention that will decide France's future. But the paranoia is just beginning. With foreign armies advancing and rumors of prison plots, mobs storm Paris prisons in early September. For 5 days, they conduct impromptu trials and executions. Over 1,000 prisoners, common criminals, prostitutes, priests who refuse to swear loyalty to the revolution, and yes, some genuine counter-revolutionaries, are butchered. The September massacres are a preview of the violence to come. The new National Convention meets in September with one clear mandate: to decide what to do with the king. The Girondins want to spare him, perhaps exile him. The Jacobins, led by Robespierre, demand death. The debates are fierce, philosophical, desperate. Can you put a king on trial like a common citizen? If sovereignty truly resides in the people, can anyone be above the law? The numbers tell a grim story. A common laborer in Paris spent roughly half his daily wages just on bread, when bread was available. Bad harvests in the 1780s sent grain prices soaring. Meanwhile, France was drowning in debt, largely from financing the American Revolution. The irony is almost too perfect: France helped America fight for liberty and equality, then returned home to a population that had neither. Marie Antoinette, the Austrian-born queen, became the symbol of everything people hated about the monarchy. Did she actually say, "Let them eat cake," when told the people had no bread? Almost certainly not. But the fact that people believed she would say such a thing tells you everything about how disconnected the royal family seemed from reality. By 1788, France was a pressure cooker with the valve sealed shut. The government was bankrupt. The people were hungry. And Louis, in a moment of either courage or desperation, made a fateful decision: he would summon the Estates General, a representative assembly that hadn't met in 175 years. He needed approval for new taxes. What he got instead was revolution. When the Estates General convened in May 1789 at Versailles, the Third Estate arrived with a simple demand: voting by head count rather than by estate. Under the old system, the nobility and clergy could outvote the commoners 2-1, even though the Third Estate represented 97% of France. The king refused their demand. Big mistake. On June 20, the Third Estate found themselves locked out of their meeting hall. Believing this was an attempt to disband them, they gathered in a nearby indoor tennis court and took an oath: they would not disband until France had a constitution. This was the tennis court oath, and it was nothing less than open defiance of royal authority. The representatives of the common people had declared themselves the true voice of France. The king could have crushed them. He had the army. He had the power. But Louis hesitated, paralyzed by indecision. And in that hesitation, the revolution found its opening. Within weeks, that opening would become a flood that would drown the old world in blood. July 1789. Louis XVI made his second catastrophic mistake. Unnerved by the defiance of the Third Estate, he began moving troops toward Paris and Versailles. Officially, this was to maintain order. But when a king surrounds the capital with soldiers, people assume the worst. Rumors spread through Paris like wildfire: the king was preparing to crush the National Assembly, the new name the Third Estate had given itself, and massacre anyone who resisted. The city erupted. Parisians didn't wait to see if the rumors were true. They began arming themselves. The problem was finding weapons and, more critically, gunpowder. The city's arsenals held some muskets, but ammunition was scarce. Then someone remembered: there was a fortress in eastern Paris that held the royal gunpowder reserves. It was called the Bastille. The Bastille was more symbol than strategic target. This medieval fortress had once housed political prisoners, but by 1789 it held only 7 inmates. 4 forgers, 2 madmen, and 1 aristocrat locked up at his family's request. But symbols matter. The Bastille represented royal tyranny, lettres de cachet, those sealed orders by which the king could imprison anyone without trial. And on the morning of July 14, it represented something else, gunpowder the people desperately needed. What started as a demand for ammunition became a siege. The fortress governor, Bernard-René de Launay, found himself trapped in an impossible situation. He had fewer than 100 soldiers, some elderly and unreliable. Outside, the crowd swelled to nearly 1,000, then more. They demanded entry. De Launay stalled, hoping for orders that never came. Then someone cut the chains to the drawbridge. The crowd surged forward. De Launay panicked and ordered his men to fire. The massacre was brief but brutal, nearly 100 attackers fell dead or wounded in minutes. But instead of retreating, the crowd's rage intensified. French guards, soldiers who had defected to the people's side, arrived with cannons. They trained them on the fortress gates. De Launay knew he was finished. He contemplated blowing up the entire fortress, himself and the gunpowder included, taking as many attackers with him as possible. His own men talked him down. Instead, he surrendered, opening the gates on a promise of safe passage. The crowd had other plans. The moment de Launay stepped outside, the mob seized him. They beat him, stabbed him, dragged him through the streets. Someone cut off his head with a pocket knife, a butcher, some accounts say, who knew how to saw through bone. They mounted the governor's head on a pike and paraded it through Paris. The revolution had claimed its first high-profile victim, and it had tasted blood. News of the Bastille's fall spread across France within days. In the countryside, peasants who heard the news believed, wrongly but understandably, that the revolution had succeeded, that the nobility's privileges were abolished, that they were free. When they discovered this wasn't true, they decided to make it true themselves. The great fear swept through rural France. Peasants attacked chateaux, burning the documents that recorded their feudal obligations. The contracts that bound them to their lords, that extracted endless fees and labor. Some nobles fled. Others tried to reason with the mobs. A few were killed. The countryside was in open revolt, and the old order was collapsing not through decree but through fire and fury. Back in Versailles, the National Assembly faced a choice. They could try to restore order by force, to put the peasants back in their place. Or they could embrace the chaos and channel it into something new. On the night of August 4th, in one of history's most remarkable sessions, noble after noble stood and renounced their feudal privileges. Hunting rights, special taxes, hereditary offices, all abolished in a fever of revolutionary enthusiasm that lasted until dawn. Was this a genuine embrace of equality? Or was it panic, a desperate attempt to prevent total destruction? Probably both. But the result was the same: in a single night, the legal foundation of French feudalism died. A society built on hierarchy and inherited privilege for 1,000 years was dismantled in hours. Yet Louis still hadn't learned his lesson. Presented with the August Decrees and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a revolutionary document proclaiming liberty, equality, and popular sovereignty, the king hesitated. He delayed. He refused to give his formal approval. The people of Paris, especially the women who spent their days hunting for bread that didn't exist at prices they couldn't afford, had had enough of royal hesitation. They decided it was time to bring the king to Paris, where they could watch him. And they weren't going to ask nicely. October 5, 1789. It's raining in Paris, and there's no bread. Again. The market women, the fish wives, the laundresses, the street vendors who keep Paris fed, have reached their breaking point. Grain is rotting in warehouses while speculators hold it back to drive prices higher. Meanwhile, rumors reached the city that at Versailles, the royal guards held a banquet where they trampled the revolutionary tricolor cockade underfoot and toasted the king while drunk on wine. The women don't organize a formal protest. They simply start walking. Thousands of them, armed with whatever they can find, kitchen knives, pikes, a few stolen muskets. They're marching to Versailles, 12 miles through mud and rain, to demand bread from the king himself. They're joined by men, including National Guardsmen, but make no mistake, this is the Women's March, led by women, driven by the desperate fury of mothers who cannot feed their children. When they arrive at Versailles that evening, exhausted and soaked, they don't politely request an audience. They storm the palace grounds. Some force their way into the National Assembly, demanding action. A delegation meets with the king himself. Louis, utterly unprepared for this confrontation, promises bread. He promises to approve the August decrees and the Declaration of Rights. He promises everything they ask. But promises from a king who has broken so many promises before aren't enough. The crowd remains at Versailles through the night, restless, angry, waiting. Some find food and wine in the palace kitchens. Some sleep in the courtyards. And as dawn breaks on October 6, the situation explodes. A group breaks into the palace, hunting for Marie Antoinette. They want the Austrian woman, the hated queen they blame for all of France's suffering. The queen's guards fight them off in the corridors, 2 are killed, their heads later mounted on pikes. While Marie Antoinette flees through secret passages to the king's chambers. She barely escapes with her life. The Marquis de Lafayette arrives with the National Guard, restores a fragile order, and makes a fateful suggestion: perhaps the king should return to Paris with the people. It's phrased as a suggestion. Everyone knows it's a demand. Louis, Marie Antoinette, and their children are escorted out onto a balcony. The crowd below is massive, angry, armed. Lafayette kisses the queen's hand in a show of reconciliation. The crowd cheers, but the message is clear: the royal family is coming to Paris. Not as rulers returning to their capital. As prisoners. The journey back is a grotesque parade. The royal carriages creep along, surrounded by thousands of marchers. Guards' heads bob on pikes at the front of the procession. The crowd sings. They've captured the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's boy, they're mocking names for the royal family, and now they'll have bread. The king and queen, who once lived in the greatest palace in Europe, are being dragged to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, where they'll live under the watch of the revolution. For a while, there's an uneasy peace. The National Assembly, now also relocated to Paris, works on creating a constitutional monarchy. The idea is simple: France will keep its king, but he'll be subject to a constitution, to laws, to the will of the people expressed through their representatives. Louis goes along with it, or seems to. He attends sessions. He signs decrees. He plays the role of constitutional monarch. But he doesn't believe in it. In private letters, Louis makes clear he considers everything he signed to be invalid, extracted under duress. Marie Antoinette, even less reconciled to the new order, writes to her brother, the Austrian emperor, begging for foreign intervention to restore royal authority. The king and queen are going through the motions while plotting their escape. The nobility is hemorrhaging from France. Thousands of aristocrats, seeing the writing on the wall, flee across the borders into Prussia, Austria, Britain. They become the émigrés, aristocrats in exile who dream of foreign armies crushing the revolution and restoring their privileges. Their departure only feeds the revolution's paranoia: France is surrounded by enemies abroad and traitors within. June 20, 1791. The royal family makes their move. Disguised as servants of a Russian noblewoman, they slip out of the Tuileries Palace at night. The plan is to reach the eastern border, where loyal troops wait to escort them to safety and royalist support. From there, they'll orchestrate a counter-revolution with foreign backing. The escape is a disaster from the start. The heavy, conspicuous carriage moves slowly. They stop too often. They're delayed at each post. And at a small town called Varennes, just 30 miles from safety, a local postmaster named Jean-Baptiste Drouet recognizes the king's face from the image on French currency. He raises the alarm. Revolutionary authorities stop the carriage. They verify the passenger's identity. And then they turn the royal family around and escort them back to Paris. The king's flight, his clear attempt to abandon France and return with foreign armies, destroys any remaining trust. When Louis returns to Paris, the crowds are silent. No one cheers. No one jeers. They just stare in cold contempt at the king who tried to betray them. The revolution has reached a point of no return. The king has shown his true colors. And the radicals who have been arguing that monarchy itself is the problem, that France needs a republic, suddenly have all the evidence they need. The moderate phase of the revolution is ending. What comes next will be far darker, far more violent, and far more unforgiving. January 21, 1793. A cold Tuesday morning in Paris. Louis XVI, former King of France, climbs the scaffold in the Place de la Révolution. He tries to speak, to proclaim his innocence one last time, but the drums drown him out. The executioner straps him to the plank. The blade drops. And with a single stroke, France decapitates not just a king but the entire principle of monarchy. The crowd rushes forward, some dipping handkerchiefs in the royal blood as souvenirs. The unthinkable has become reality. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. How did France go from constitutional monarchy to regicide in less than 2 years? After the failed escape, the National Assembly suspended Louis from his duties but ultimately reinstated him, desperately clinging to the hope that constitutional monarchy could work. Meanwhile, the revolution was radicalizing. New factions emerged. The Girondins, moderate Republicans who wanted gradual change, and the Jacobins, radical Republicans led by Maximilien Robespierre who demanded swifter, more complete transformation. Robespierre is crucial to understanding what happens next. He wasn't a general or a warrior. He was a lawyer from Arras, provincial and awkward, nicknamed the Incorruptible, for his rigid moral principles. He rarely smiled. He dressed fastidiously. And he believed with absolute conviction that the revolution must create a republic of virtue, purged of corruption and vice, no matter the cost. That last part, no matter the cost, would prove catastrophic. In April 1792, under pressure from the Girondins who believed war would unite France and expose traitors, the Assembly declared war on Austria. Soon Prussia joined against France, then other monarchies, terrified that revolutionary ideas would spread to their own populations. The émigrés marched with foreign armies, promising to restore the old order. The Duke of Brunswick, commanding the Allied forces, issued a manifesto threatening to destroy Paris if any harm came to the royal family. This was precisely the wrong thing to say to revolutionaries who already suspected the king of treason. August 10, 1792. Parisian radicals and armed citizens stormed the Tuileries Palace. The Swiss guards defending the king fight back, killing hundreds of attackers before being overwhelmed and massacred themselves. The king and his family flee to the Assembly for protection. The Assembly, facing an armed mob, has no choice but to suspend the monarchy and call for elections to a new national convention that will decide France's future. But the paranoia is just beginning. With foreign armies advancing and rumors of prison plots, mobs storm Paris prisons in early September. For 5 days, they conduct impromptu trials and executions. Over 1,000 prisoners, common criminals, prostitutes, priests who refuse to swear loyalty to the revolution, and yes, some genuine counter-revolutionaries, are butchered. The September massacres are a preview of the violence to come. The new National Convention meets in September with one clear mandate: to decide what to do with the king. The Girondins want to spare him, perhaps exile him. The Jacobins, led by Robespierre, demand death. The debates are fierce, philosophical, desperate. Can you put a king on trial like a common citizen? If sovereignty truly resides in the people, can anyone be above the law? They find Louis guilty of treason. The vote for execution is razor-thin, 361 to 360. One vote. Louis's own cousin, Philippe Égalité, who had renounced his noble title and embraced the revolution, votes for death. It's not enough to be on the revolution's side. You have to prove you're willing to kill for it. Marie Antoinette follows her husband to the guillotine 9 months later, in October 1793. She faces death with more courage than Louis showed, maintaining her dignity even as the crowds jeer. The Austrian princess who came to France as a teenage bride dies in front of a mob that blames her for everything wrong with their world. And now the revolution enters its darkest phase, the Terror. The Committee of Public Safety, led by Robespierre, assumes dictatorial power. Their logic is simple and terrifying: France is surrounded by enemies without and traitors within. Survival requires ruthlessness. The Republic must be defended at all costs. Anyone who threatens it, or might threaten it, or could potentially threaten it, must be eliminated. The guillotine, initially adopted as a humane form of execution that treated all citizens equally, becomes the revolution's signature instrument. It's efficient. It's public. It's democratic, everyone dies the same way, noble or commoner, man or woman, revolutionary or counter-revolutionary. Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin, who had advocated for the device as a reform, watches in horror as his name becomes synonymous with mass execution. The Terror claims everyone. Priests who won't accept revolutionary religious reforms. Nobles who stayed in France thinking they'd be safe. Moderate revolutionaries who aren't radical enough. Radical revolutionaries who are too radical. The Girondins, who started the war, go to the guillotine for being too soft. Georges Danton, one of the revolution's early heroes, goes to the guillotine for suggesting maybe the Terror should end. His last words: "Show my head to the people, it is worth seeing." The revolution isn't just executing its enemies anymore. It's devouring its own children. Robespierre, the incorruptible, sends friend after friend to the scaffold, convinced that only absolute purity can save France. He speaks of virtue and terror as complementary forces. Terror without virtue is barbarous, he proclaims, virtue without terror is powerless. Between September 1793 and July 1794, the Revolutionary Tribunal in Paris alone sentences over 2,600 people to death. Across France, the number reaches 16,000 to 40,000, depending on how you count. And these are just the official executions. Thousands more die in prison, in the brutal suppression of counter-revolutionary uprisings, in the drownings at Nantes where revolutionaries tie priests and prisoners in boats and sink them. The question everyone in Paris asks themselves each morning is simple: will today be the day they come for me? July 27, 1794, 9 Thermidor in the revolutionary calendar that had replaced even the measurement of time. Maximilien Robespierre stands before the National Convention, and for the first time in months, he's afraid. The deputies who once hung on his every word now shout him down. Down with the tyrant, they scream. The incorruptible, the man who sent thousands to the guillotine in the name of virtue, is about to learn that terror is a weapon that eventually turns on those who wield it. What happened? Simple mathematics. Robespierre had created a system where anyone could be accused, anyone could be suspect, anyone could die. And the members of the convention finally realized that if they didn't stop him, they would all eventually end up on the scaffold. Survival instinct overcame revolutionary fervor. They voted to arrest him. Robespierre tried to rally support, tried to call the Paris Commune to his defense, but his allies hesitated. When soldiers arrived to arrest him, he attempted suicide, shooting himself in the jaw. He botched it, succeeding only in shattering his face. The next day, July 28, Robespierre went to the guillotine, unable to speak, his ruined jaw wrapped in bandages. 21 of his allies followed him. The crowds that had cheered revolutionary justice for so long cheered again as the architect of the terror was consumed by his own creation. The terror ended not because people suddenly rediscovered mercy, but because everyone was exhausted. France had been in constant crisis for 5 years. The economy was in ruins. The wars continued. The government had executed so many people that there was no one left to execute without turning completely on itself. The Thermidorian reaction, as historians call the period after Robespierre's fall, was less a return to sanity than a collective collapse from exhaustion. But here's what's remarkable: despite the chaos, the bloodshed, the terror, the revolution had fundamentally transformed France in ways that could never be undone. Feudalism was dead. The privileges of nobility and clergy were abolished. The idea that all citizens were equal before the law, that sovereignty resided in the people rather than in a king chosen by God, these ideas had been written in blood, but they were now permanent features of French consciousness. The revolutionary government had also, almost accidentally, created the modern nation-state. To fight the wars against the European coalition, France instituted the levée en masse, mass conscription. For the first time in European history, entire populations were mobilized for war. This wasn't an army of mercenaries or professional soldiers, this was the nation in arms, citizens fighting for France rather than for a king. And despite being surrounded by enemies, despite the internal chaos, France was winning. The revolutionary armies, motivated by ideology rather than pay, fighting for a republic rather than a monarch, proved surprisingly effective. They pushed back the Prussians, the Austrians, the British. Young generals rose through merit rather than birth. One of them, a Corsican artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte, showed particular promise. Napoleon. That's a name to remember, because he's waiting in the wings, and he'll eventually do what no one else could, bring order to France. But the price will be the end of the Republic and the creation of an empire. The revolution will come full circle, replacing one form of authoritarianism with another. But that's a different story. The Directory, the government that followed Robespierre, was corrupt and unstable, but at least it wasn't actively guillotining people en masse. France stumbled through the late 1790s, winning wars abroad while the government at home grew increasingly dysfunctional. People were tired of revolution, tired of ideology, tired of sacrifice. They wanted stability, prosperity, normalcy. What did the French Revolution accomplish? That depends on who you ask and when you ask them. In the immediate aftermath, it looked like failure, hundreds of thousands dead, the economy wrecked, and within a generation, a new emperor on the throne. But zoom out, and the picture changes. The revolution destroyed the old regime permanently. Kings would return to France. First the Bourbons would be restored after Napoleon's fall, then overthrown again in 1830, then replaced by another monarchy, then overthrown again in 1848. But none of these restored monarchies could truly go back to the world before 1789. The idea of absolute monarchy, of divine right, of hereditary privilege as the natural order, these ideas were dead in France, killed by the revolution. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen became a template for liberal democratic movements worldwide. Its principles, liberty, equality, fraternity, would echo through the next 2 centuries of political struggle. Every subsequent revolution, from Latin America to Europe to Asia, would reference French revolutionary ideals. But the revolution also established a darker precedent, the idea that political virtue could justify unlimited violence, that enemies of the people deserved no mercy, that terror could be a tool of governance. The Bolsheviks would study the French Revolution carefully. So would Mao. The pattern of revolution devouring its own leaders, of ideological purity tests leading to purges, of utopian dreams producing dystopian nightmares, France wrote that playbook. Perhaps the revolution's ultimate legacy is this profound tension: it proved that ordinary people could overthrow seemingly invincible systems of power, that the old order wasn't natural or inevitable, that humans could reshape their political world. But it also revealed how quickly liberation can turn to oppression, how revolutionary movements can betray their own ideals, how the pursuit of perfect virtue can produce perfect terror. The French people in 1789 wanted bread, dignity, and a voice in their own governance. Simple, reasonable demands. The path to achieving those demands led through the execution of a king, the Terror, wars that engulfed Europe, and deaths numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Was it worth it? France emerged transformed, modernized, and powerful. But ask the question to someone whose family member died on the guillotine, and you'll get a different answer. History doesn't offer clean moral lessons. The French Revolution was simultaneously the birth of modern democracy and a cautionary tale about revolutionary excess. It was liberation and bloodshed, idealism and fanaticism, progress and catastrophe. It was, in other words, intensely human, capable of both inspiring and horrifying in equal measure. When the people turned on their king in 1789, they unleashed forces they couldn't control. They discovered that destroying an old world is easier than building a new one. And they learned that revolutions, once started, follow their own logic toward conclusions no one intended. The guillotine still stands in museums, a reminder of what happens when societies fracture and when the pursuit of political purity becomes indistinguishable from murder. Blood, guillotines, and total chaos, the subtitle promised these things, and the revolution delivered. But it also delivered ideas about human equality and popular sovereignty that continue to shape our world. 2.5 centuries later, we're still wrestling with the French Revolution's contradictions, still trying to achieve its promises without repeating its horrors. The revolution never truly ended. It just transformed into the ongoing struggle to balance liberty with order, equality with diversity, and progress with stability. And that struggle continues today. The French Revolution changed everything. And the world has never been the same since.